Welcome to Fast Politics, Isaac.
Thank you so much for having me, Molly.
So the book is called 2024, How Republicans Took the White House and the Democrats Lost America. I'm going to ask you a Passover question. How is this book different than all other books?
This is really the defining, definitive inside account of the election that we just had from start to end. Some books have covered just one campaign or the other. Some have started just kind of with the debate and in the final stretch. But this really goes back to the beginning in terms of, for both Trump and Biden, the decision to run again, which was not inevitable for either of them, or that neither party would let, or that both parties would let that happen, right? That no one would be able to get their respective parties to move on from those septuagenarians, and then seeing that story develop throughout both primaries, through the debate, through the Democrats switch, and then finally with the result that we all saw in November.
Okay, so let's keep going with this. What made Biden lose? If you could give me sort of two reasons why Biden lost.
The first answer is the most obvious one, which is age.
Right.
Most Americans thought he was too old to do the job, and they couldn't get past that. The mistake that his advisors made was viewing that as a perception problem rather than a
Right.
reality problem, right? The case that they were making is, well, he can do this job as president. He doesn't communicate that well. He doesn't campaign that well. He doesn't debate as well as he used to. Remember, that was the line. But when
Right.
he's in the Situation Room, when he's in the Oval Office, he can do the job. And what that argument really fatally overlooks is that communicating is the number one job of the president. If you cannot communicate about your agenda and your accomplishments and your leadership, then you cannot do the job. There is no difference between doing the job and being able to communicate about the job. The second factor for Biden is that the Democrats were not able, they acknowledged during the campaign that they needed to come up with a winning economic argument. And they never got there. They never got there with Biden, and they never got there with Harris. There's actually some great reporting in the book during Harris's debate prep. I know you asked about Biden.
I want to square the circle with Biden for a minute. I was told by Jake Tapper that Biden ran a cover up about his age. So how did Biden run a cover up about his age? And also, the American people didn't vote for him because he was too old. Is it, as Jake Tapper tells us again and again and again, a cover up? Or was it that people thought he was too old? Are you on team cover up? I just am curious.
Our reporting is that Biden and his staff were completely aware of his limitations, completely aware of the political problems that those limitations posed. They thought that they could muscle through them.
Right.
They thought that they could choreograph events to downplay them, and they thought that when push came to shove and Americans were forced to choose between that and Trump,
And
they
Trump,
would
they were,
choose Biden, and they were wrong
but the polling suggests that there was not a cover up,
because
right?
Americans
Knew
knew
it
that he
seems
was too
sounds
old.
like Americans knew exactly what his administration knew. So is that a cover up? I'm just curious.
To me, a cover-up means a secret that was hidden, and
Right.
Biden's age was not a
Was
secret.
not a secret that was hidden. I'm just curious. Look, I love Jake Tapper and I have so much respect for how many books he sold. So talk to me about Harris. So Harris gets 100 days in, Biden finally drops out. Harris gets to run for president, but she doesn't get to run for president as if she were a new candidate. So explain to us that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That was one of the things that I learned from doing the book was how much Harris, she didn't do everything that she could to escape Biden's shadow, right?
Right.
She was repeatedly given the option to distance herself, and she wouldn't take it. Now, based on our reporting, some of that is honestly her position, right? Like, she was part of his administration, and she didn't feel like she could honestly run from that. The other factor is Biden made that harder for her because he actually came out and told her, even on the day of the
Right.
debate, came to her and said don't distance yourself from me. It would be bad for you. But
Right.
even
No
be
daylight. Right. That's the famous no daylight.
that particular word choice is not the phrasing that we have in
Okay.
our reporting, but there was a conversation where he told her that it would be politically bad for her to distance herself.
Do you agree with that
Well,
from your
no.
reporting?
Uh,
Right.
I mean, not based on what the voters wanted to see, and that certainly
Yeah.
wasn't the Republican sense of it. And
Right.
in hindsight, or even at the time, a lot of her advisors admitted that the way that she bungled that question at the View was the biggest mistake of the campaign. Rivaled only by the trans ad, but the trans ad was
Right.
something that was from years earlier,
Right.
whereas that was a mistake that was made during the campaign.
Right.
But even beyond that, a lot of people were obviously critical of the campaign that Harris ran in 2019 for the 2020 primary, and a lot of people had a low view of her potential or had concerns about her potential as a candidate. But the reality is, whether she could have run a better campaign for herself or not in 2024, she really never got the chance. I mean,
Yeah.
basically,
Yeah.
with 100 days out, there was no time to do any of the kind of strategic and tactical thinking that you have to do to run a campaign that actually fits the candidate, where the messenger and the message work together. There was just no time to do that. They just moved forward with the Biden campaign as it was,
Yeah.
including
Yeah.
with a lot of the same advisors who were Biden people who had
Right.
come up with the policies that the Biden administration was struggling to defend. So, you know, how is she supposed to she just
Yeah.
there wasn't a chance for her to do a complete reboot. She never got the chance to run her own campaign and see if she could have gotten farther on her own.
I wonder if you could talk about the sort of consultant class and where they got involved in, like, you certainly saw moments, like I saw Tim Walz, and maybe because I also am friendly with him, I feel a little responsible for this on some level, but like Tim Walz, whenever I interviewed him, I thought this guy is really got a little bit of political magic, right? Like when he speaks, he's pretty good. He's got very likable, very Midwestern. Like I just thought there were a lot of elements about him that I thought were really good. And he had a number of really good speeches. And then something happened when I was watching him and he stopped and they didn't let him out. And there was that with her too. She sort of had a lot of fire. And then there was like a month in the middle where you just didn't see her. And I wonder if you could talk about that and what that was and what you sort of saw that to be.
So that month you're talking about where she didn't do any interviews, that's another mistake that the team will acknowledge in hindsight
Who
privately.
whose idea was that and why?
Well, the thinking was, for Walls that he couldn't do an interview until she did an interview. And
Okay.
with her, they wanted to wait until the convention to introduce her.
Right.
They wanted to be able to define that story for themselves. Harris also
That was by the way, a huge mistake. I think we can all
well,
agree.
well, the Trump
Keep the
campaign certainly used that time to get out ahead
right.
to start this storyline that she was hiding, and that contributed to this sense that you were hearing from voters that they didn't know who she was. That was
Right.
that was valuable time that the Trump campaign was able to capitalize on instead of the Harris campaign. The other reality that we learned in our reporting is that Harris personally this kind of comes from her prosecutorial training. She
Right.
requires a lot of prep to
Yeah,
do
that
an
I've
interview.
heard
It's
that.
how she
Yeah.
works. And so, the amount of time that it took her away from the trail to prepare for every one of those interviews, there was a
Right.
trade-off there also. And at first, that wasn't a trade-off that they were as willing to make. And it was later on that they decided either that they were going to take that time away to do the prep or that she was going to start doing interviews with less prep.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That I had heard that she really I mean, what I had heard was that she didn't really like doing interviews, that she was much better with debating, which you could I mean, she's a really good debater. I thought she was a really good debater, and that she took a long time to prep, that she really wanted to prep like a prosecutor, which is totally insane because you can't prep for an interview. You just have to go in there and talk, you know? I mean, I think anyway. And certainly Donald Trump has never prepped for anything in his life. What do you think? Let's talk about the Trump campaign. It strikes me that they really just put him in the culture and took the idea that politics is downstream of culture and just got him in everywhere. My sense is that he just did everything and it worked. But was there some method to the madness?
Yes, that was one of the specific things that they set out to do. They called it making him a cultural icon instead of a
Yeah,
political figure. And,
which
that
is
that came very
really
naturally to Trump. That's who he was for most of his
right.
life. He was a celebrity. He was not a politician. And you could see this as early on as the primary. He went to a frat house for a pregame before a football game in Iowa. Do you know a lot of 77 or 78-year-old politicians who could just show up at a frat house and flip burgers? I mean,
I mean,
those kinds of settings really played to his strengths, based on the kind of personality that he was for most of his life. And that was actually an opportunity for younger voters, younger audiences
right, to
to
get to know
introduce
him.
them. They didn't know that. They don't remember Trump before he was the politician. And so that was a really powerful way to reintroduce him.
What's funny is that I actually think that a lot of politicians could do that if they let them do that. But Democratic politics, for whatever reason, and I'd love you to like square the circle because you guys just wrote this book about the two campaigns. It strikes me that the level of carefulness in the Biden Harris, like keep them cloistered, keep them safe, keep them from speaking, is the largest sort of fuck up. Because, like, had you sent, here's just, I'm going to give you, this is my own hobby horse, but I'm going to give you, I'm torturing you. I know, I'm sorry. First the Tapper question, now this, but it's my podcast. So, but it strikes me that if you had let Tim Walz or Harris do the number of interviews, and again, maybe they weren't, Theo Vaughn might not have wanted to have Harris on, and Joe Rogan may have, I've heard conflicting stories about what happened with the Joe Rogan thing, whether he wanted her, whether that was too far away, who knows? Somebody
Well,
told
we
me,
have the reporting on that, so
yeah.
I
So
could tell
tell me,
you.
tell me.
So Walls had a lot more success getting on podcasts than Harris. It's
Did
also
they
true.
not want her?
Yes, they got a lot of no's.
Really?
A lot of non-political podcasts that have left-leaning audiences said no because they didn't want to bring politics into the space.
Like who?
The Travis and Jason Kelsey podcast said no.
Okay.
The Bill Simmons podcast said
Oh,
no.
wow.
They couldn't get on Hot Ones either.
Oh,
Um,
wow. The hot sauce show?
Hot Ones.
Yeah,
Sean
yeah, that's a
Evans, yeah.
hot sauce show.
Yeah, I'm not a podcast person. And, and then, with Rogan, it was a lot of back and forth, and, Rogan wanted her to come do it in Texas, and so they set up that rally in Texas, but then they actually, by the time they didn't really give Rogan's team a heads up that they were doing that, so then by the time they scheduled that, it was almost too late, and finally, Rogan offered the campaign a time, and they didn't take it. So, it's kind of a missed connection. But,
Yeah, it's a fuck up on their part. Subway Takes Guys said he thought she was so bad they killed it. They
Rogan?
only aired Walls. The Subway Takes Guys, that's a podcast too. So wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, you've heard Democrats talk about this asymmetry in the manosphere or the podcast, right?
Right.
That,
Mm.
those right-wing so-called manosphere podcasts, were really happy to bring Trump on and to get political in ways that kind of either there aren't equivalents on the left or the closest thing to equivalents on the left we're not willing to do.
This is such a crazy, I had no idea. At some point, did they know they were going to lose in Harris World? And when?
Our reporting is that their internal tracking polls never showed her ahead. They showed it very close, in the swing states up until the end. And she personally, she didn't write a concession speech. She was not expecting to lose. It did not feel to Harris and Walls up through the last night. It did not feel like a losing campaign. And that has to do with why you didn't see her on election night.
Wow. I would love you to talk about something that I have written about, have saw, and am really interested in, which is this idea that people, and John McCreesh
McCreesh.
wrote a really good piece about this that Trump voters wouldn't believe that Trump was going to do the things he said he would do on the campaign, that there was a suspension of disbelief among the voters. Can you sort of talk to me about if you saw reporting that spoke to this?
I think you have to distinguish between different parts of the Trump coalition.
Yeah,
If you're going to a Trump rally and talking to diehards, they
right,
absolutely take him literally and
right,
they're absolutely thrilled about that.
right,
Um,
right,
but abortion, there are other issues and other, more persuadable voters that the Trump campaign was able to convert. And we could look at abortion as a good example of this, where the Democrats would attack him as being responsible for overturning Roe v. Wade
right,
and wanting to impose a national abortion ban. And Trump came out with this position of leave it to the states. And when they presented that to these persuadable voters they were targeting, those voters liked that position.
right,
So there was an ability for voters to compartmentalize with Trump. I think
right,
that they could vote for him because of immigration, or they could vote for him because of the economy and pay
right.
less attention to
To the
the
other side.
rougher edges that they weren't as focused on.
So interesting. Thank you so much for joining us, Isaac.
That flew by. Thank you so much for having me.